welcome to this episode of Live with Lizzie, powered by the China Project. Today we have a very special guest, Jacob Dreyer. Jacob, I wonder if you can, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how it led to you spending over a decade in Shanghai.
Sure. Thanks, Lizzie. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia, and I grew up always wanting to be a writer, but I have no connection with China really, or I didn't grow up having one. I'm not ethnically Chinese, no East Asian family members, anything like that. I went to college in also Virginia in William and Mary, and when I graduated in 2008, I came to Shanghai for what I thought was just kind of like a gap year adventure sort of thing. Now, what was interesting to me, so my father suggested I go to China because he had this kind of belief, I guess he got it from like investing in the stock market or something, that China was the future, which some people in 2008 were starting to have. But what was interesting to me even at the time was it was a pretty niche thing for me to go to China in 2008. My classmates reacted kind of like if I said, I'm moving to Ethiopia or Brazil, like, oh, that's cool. Hope you don't get an upset stomach from the food there. See you around in Fairfax, Northern Virginia sometime soon. And anyway, so I went to Shanghai. It was a really interesting experience for me, especially, I grew up in and went to college in small towns in Virginia. So when I came to Shanghai, it was very different. And I was not sure if that was because it was China or it was a big city or what exactly the reason was. But anyway, my year was over and I went to graduate school in London at the Architecture Association, because I kind of thought that I was really interested in this big city. I didn't really get that it was a China thing. So I spent a year in London. That was great. I then came back to Shanghai in 2010. I spent another year in Shanghai, and I sort of was starting to realize how interesting China as a society was and how few ways I had of finding out about it as a person who couldn't read the Chinese language, which I at the time could not. And so I decided, okay, in my very kind of path-dependent way, I was like, the way to think about things for a living is to be a college professor. So I should go to NYU in New York to do a PhD in East Asian Studies, because somehow studying architecture, I still didn't feel like I was looking at the Shanghai skyline and be like, oh, this all makes sense to me. I didn't understand yet. No, I thought maybe it's because I don't know Chinese. So I was going to do graduate school with Zhang Shudong, who was running the East Asian Studies department at that time. And for a variety of reasons, it didn't turn into a PhD because the East Asian Studies department was kind of had its own internal issues, both specific, but I would say, if you think about the situation of the humanities in US universities right now, I think a lot of places have their own specific issues, right? So for whatever reason, I kept feeling like in my early 20s, I was trying to find a place for myself to meet my goal of just thinking about things and exploring in New York and London. But I actually paradoxically found that Shanghai was the best place for me to do that I could always make a living here. And anyway, and then time went on. I had my adventures in my early 20s, including seeing Kaiser Kuo and the Great Leap Brewery in sometime in 2014. And slowly I remember when Mr. Trump got elected, it felt like such a shock. But when I looked at my diary entries from 2014 and 2015, it felt like I wanted to return to the US, but I was like, I'm just going to wait until things become sort of normal, whatever that means. But I was like, if I look in 2014 or 2015, I had this clear sense of like, something is not right at home. I really hope it gets right. And then on my 30th birthday, November 9th, 2016, Mr. Trump got elected. I was at the West Bund Art and Design Fair in Shanghai at that time. It was our morning because it was you guys' evening, right? And some Chinese art collector kind of laughed at me and said, Sasha Arli, which as you may know means at age 30, you know where you are in the world. Right. And I was like, oh, at age 30, I know that I'm in the VIP whiskey bar of the Art Basel, the Shanghai Art and Design Fair, drinking whiskey with some Indonesian guy because I'm so worried about Mr. Trump being elected president. And I had gotten in 2015 a job at Palgrave, which is an academic publisher. And was like the China guy. My job was to find Chinese intellectuals and to publish their books. And at first I was like, okay, cool. This is an interesting day job. I'd played around in media and art world and stuff. But I think that a desire for stability, a sense of like, the big flood is coming, let me make sure I'm on my boat kind of feeling, I started to take my job more seriously and also to sort of engage with what these Chinese intellectuals were writing more seriously. My time in graduate school, I was very much learning the kind of Marxism of the Ivy League variety. And then I started, it's strange because the Chinese government and the people who are its theorists, they're no secret to what they're talking about. They really publish voluminously on every topic you can imagine. But somehow what they're saying is very boring if you consider things like Chinese investments in Indonesian nickel mines boring. And it seems somehow more boring than, I don't know, Gramsci's theory of ideology and the Brooklyn housing market or whatever. But I started to really be like, okay, the world is really clearly changing. And I think China has a lot to do with those changes. And I can observe, like a stray cat that figures out that this is where the food comes every night. I can observe that when I'm in China, I'm having a good life that I like, and I can be healthy here, and I have a job here. And many of my friends in the United States were not necessarily meeting checking all those boxes. So I decided to really start engaging and try to learn as a grad student, almost continuing my education in my publishing job, to just sort of be like, so what is really going on with all these 50-year-old men in Zhongguancun, which is a neighborhood in Beijing where the universities are? What do they think about the world? Do I find that their view is coherent? And I think an important thing for me about the Chinese government, whether what they believe is quote unquote true or not, their beliefs and the way they act on them can influence reality, whether it's true or not. For example, is China a peacemaker in Iran? Well, no, that's not true until they decide that it is true, and then it's true, right? So I started to sort of feel that what I did first thought was a kind of random and kind of boring job was actually a really unique opportunity for me to learn about what's going on in China at a time when not many people know what that is.
Fantastic. Let's turn to your New York Times op-ed a little bit. As you mentioned, you had a publisher job. And you highlighted the fact in the article that many Chinese IR scholars you came across on that job actually hold deep respect for American values, despite the seeming rise of those, nationalistic keyboard warriors, the little pinkies. I wonder if you can tell us a little more about that. How do they engage with the United States? How do they actually view the United States? I'm speaking of serious scholars in the in a Chinese circle.
Well, so Lizzie, as I wrote to you, a lot of these people, I don't want to say the majority because I don't want to make up statistics, but a lot of the elite scholars did PhDs in the United States. And if you do a PhD in the United States, it takes like 7 years. So if you're talking about like Gan Yang, Cui Zhiyuan, 那个谁，王绍光, Yao Yang, Zheng Yongnian, I could keep going. But like a real laundry list of these guys, they all spent their 5 to 7 years in Chicago and Boston and California or whatever. So one thing I think in general is that where maybe not the average American has a deep lived sense of China, but a lot of Chinese people, particularly these elite Chinese people, they've actually spent a lot of time in the US. They may own property here. And that, by the way, includes, you have Eric X. Lee, the nationalist Guancha guy, who owns a ranch in Napa Valley. And he lived in California for 30 years. And he's Donald Rumsfeld invested in his VC fund, So I guess the point is just that the United States, not just as an abstract concept, but as like a significant period of their lives, it's part of these people's psychological makeup in the way that like my time in college, I changed a lot. I had good times, I had bad times, but I'm forever different because of that. So I think that almost all of these people, first and foremost, when they're thinking about the United States, they're thinking of like, oh, I better call my daughter who lives there. Or maybe they're thinking of like that great time when I learned so much and I was young. And unfortunately now I'm in my 50s and I have this day job, but I'll always remember, that first time I went skiing in Brattleboro, Vermont, or whatever it might be. So I think, if anything, even more the case among people in the so-called hard sciences. So with social sciences, a lot of people have, but I think for serious researchers in say semiconductors or something, almost all of them have. And that's just the nature of the beast, right? That's because, when a lot of these people were starting their career, if you're 50 now, so when you're 20, that's today minus 30 years, the United States was way more advanced than China. And so all the ambitious Chinese people would go there. And I think that some of them have felt, frankly, like I have in the past few years, this sense that this powerful and free and open country that you just took for granted, like the air and the sky, maybe that those things aren't the way they are, but you're really confused. You're not really sure. You have a sense of like, obviously I don't necessarily just believe the Chinese government discourse. Now, what about the New York Times? The New York Times is reporting these alarming things too. Well, are they right? Okay, let me ask my friend who lives there. Okay, one friend who lives there says it's all fine, and the other says it's really terrible. So I have a feeling that a lot of these people are confused, are certainly do not. I mean, the notion of China having a war with the United States, it just seems so crazy, like just on beyond crazy to anyone, and especially anyone who's a grown-up who's lived in the United States, but I think also just to anyone. And I think that also Chinese people, some of these people I'm talking about, have just been really shocked by some of the things that have happened in the US. And I also think it's really interesting to note that a significant subset, my friend David Ownby, who edits Reading the China Dream, has noticed this big subset of Chinese so-called liberals, meaning the people who oppose the current government, who've all become big Trumpists because they've taken the Trump narrative and they're like, wow, Mr. Trump really was right. The deep state really is colluding with the CCP, and that's why. But the point is, you had this once stable thing which you took really for granted, this like really placid pond. You used to sit beside it, and now there's a big storm and the waves are going up and down, and you're just kind of like, what's going on?
Fantastic. In the article, you also point out that the younger generation of Chinese, at least from your vantage point in Shanghai, is becoming more educated, more cosmopolitan. But we also seem to have this tendency of the Chinese government's policy being more hostile, especially toward the West or the United States specifically. How can we reconcile those two opposing forces? And, from your point of view, which force is likely to prevail in shaping the future of US-China relations?
So I think that it's indisputable that the Chinese population is having more and more access to higher education. There's this great guy who's working at NYU Shanghai, Li Angran, who's researching that. But you can just basically, I think what's happening in China as far as higher education right now is similar to the US in the 1950s and 1960s, where the number of college graduates goes from like 2% or 3% to like 30%. In generational differences. So the amount of people with college education is becoming much, much bigger. Now, you might think, and I do think, what college education? Maybe it's not all Peking University. It could be like, for example, the Hubei Gongye Dache. But there's also a lot of these kind of upswell of these newly educated youths who maybe they're aware that their university is kind of not as good as it should be. And especially during the pandemic, many of them were unable to go to classes. They're just in their dorms on Zoom. The moral of the story is that there's just a lot of young Chinese people with access to more resources than ever before. And I think they are thoughtful. And I think that China definitely will change as a consequence. People like Li Cheng at Brookings Institution, for example, also writes a lot about that. How does that impact the United States? I don't think that the United States is a static and unchanging thing. So, I mean, would an educated person de facto, just because they're educated like the United States? I mean, maybe. I'm educated. I'm also an American. I may be upset by some things that happen in the United States. Maybe sometimes the US government does things that I don't like. Is that because I'm stupid or uneducated? I don't know, but I would be cautious of saying that just because someone has education means they will definitely unambiguously and always like what the US government does. So I think it really depends on what's the US that we actually find. And of course, you see a lot of times, especially, because I'm working at this company that includes Nature, the science journal. So you'll see a lot of these Chinese, kind of social networks of in your 20s, you're a sciences researcher wanting to do a PhD. So stories like the Chinese kids who get like mugged or shot in Chicago, or students at U Chicago. I think there were 2 last year. So they're just like, oh my gosh, this guy from Hangzhou got like killed. Maybe I should go to the university in Hangzhou after all. So I think the long and short of it is that Chinese becoming more sophisticated and educated is great for the world, period, and especially for China. They will encounter an economy that's more knowledge driven and sophisticated. And I personally think that all sorts of interesting innovations and new technologies will come out of China. How they feel about the US really just depends on what US they find.
Right. Fantastic. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the media environment we live in. What do you think is the most commonly understood aspect of China by the American public? And what story do you think is the most underreported about China by the English language media, as far as you can tell?
I think, and it's natural why we would, that we focus a lot on the foreign policy and the interactions of the US government with China on something like Taiwan, for example. And sometimes we think about stuff which frankly is not yesterday's news, but 5 years ago's news for China, such as Hong Kong protest movement. Like that's still, regularly. I think that for the person in the street in Shanghai, or since a lot of the commentators on my piece were like, oh, Jacob, you're just talking about Shanghai. What about the rest of the country? My wife is from Daqing in Heilongjiang province, so people up there as well. The concern is really primarily about China's economy, and China's economy is having a lot of just really fundamental changes. One is the way that the relationship to the United States, which is less about some sort of politically driven decoupling, and it's more about, does China want to be the factory of the world or the marketplace of the world? Is China about these like consuming middle classes, or is it about these like blue collar working classes? And that's a lot of things, but it's a big identity crisis. There's this the housing market changing, and how the Chinese government is trying to encourage equities and stocks. I guess I would just say China is going. It's a very imperfect analogy, of course, for political reasons, like the political system. But I think that the sort of changes the U.S. had in the 1960s, where you had this older conservative, what Damien Macropolo calls the builder generation. They're kind of giving way to the generation that grew up under prosperity, and they may be bored with it. They may take it for granted, and they may see a lot of the hypocrisies of their parents' generation, and they may want to change those things. And first and foremost, the things that they want to change are the material conditions of life in China. So I think that when we read about China, we're reading about, some, Chinese ship in the South China Sea that like some US airplane saw or something like that. Or maybe we're reading about, how Chinese tourists may or may not be returning to Thailand. Those things aren't unimportant, but I think in China, from my perspective, right now, there's this huge expectation and pent-up energy about the economy, and not just economic growth, but the structure of the economy, who gets what, where. And a lot of reforms that people have been talking about for a long time, like a property tax, which 2/3 of Chinese household wealth is in real estate. So a property tax would be a pretty revolutionary thing. So let's see if they do it. There's a sense that China is really changing profoundly internally in an economic way, but that impacts everyone's daily life. And I think that's kind of hard to pick up on. So we kind of see or hear the weird sounds coming from outside of the house. But what we don't see is that inside of the house, there's this big dinner party and an argument in the family about it. We just hear this some kind of weird thumping.